All right, guys, welcome to our Q&A session here. I'm Taylor Windham. You guys, most of y'all know me. If you're watching this on Facebook, I guess we're friends. And my dad is with me, Tony Windham here. He's going to be asking our questions for this evening. His job is to interrogate me and push me on my answers. So we'll see how this goes. I think we've been doing this back and forth for a few years, so we know how each other works and how we talk and how we like to have questions answered and how we like to have them asked. So if you are benefiting from this video or any of our videos, please share them, like, comment. This will also be uploaded to the pastor and the schoolmaster on audio here shortly, maybe tomorrow, sometime this weekend. So glad you guys are with us. If you are able to submit a question, I will try to see it here close to me and be able to read it. If we don't get to you, I apologize. Sorry about that. But if we don't get to your questions, maybe we'll catch you on the next go round. So thank you guys, and with that, I'll turn it over to my dad here.
All right. Well, Taylor, thank you for having me. I'm just going to start off with just a list of questions I thought would be either interesting subject matter or questions that maybe either Christians or even non-Christians, unbelievers, that may want to have answered by someone who is studied in the Bible.
Well, I'll do my best to fill in for that role, even though I'm not necessarily qualified.
All right. Well, we'll start off with some easy questions.
All right.
And then we'll kind of lead into something a little bit more harder, a little more scripture-based.
All right.
To start things off, one of the questions that I've heard people ask or question from Christians or just in quote-unquote good people is everybody knows or is familiar with what a white lie is.
Yeah.
So is committing a white lie okay?
So when we say okay, I'm assuming you mean, is it a sin, right? Is it a sin or is it not a sin? Or are you just asking in a non-moral, way? Because
is it sinful?
Okay, so this is a hard answer in a sense because there are many principles in the Old and New Testament that lay out the idea that honesty or even omission of the truth can be viewed as a lie, as a sinful misgiving of the truth. Maybe a different way to put that. So there's this concept that we oftentimes adhere to in our daily lives, that if it's a moral or it has a higher purpose or a more valuable meaning or it spares someone suffering, maybe would be the way to say it, then a white lie is okay. We hear that, right? You hear examples, for example, the one I've always heard is you hear about Jews in the Holocaust who, or maybe Germans in the Holocaust rather, who were harboring Jews in their house, and when the Gestapo would come to their door, they would say something like, do you have Jews in your house? Have you seen Jews that are on the run from us? And they would say no. And they've got them hiding in the basement, a family of 5 or 7. And we would say that serves a greater good. It's a more moral obligation. Dietrich Bonhoeffer talked about this a lot when he wrote his famous work. Obviously, being a German theologian and pastor, he was one of the people who tried to carry out an assassination attempt on Hitler. And he wrote, in his opinion, that if there is a valid, more higher moral argument or moral purpose or meaning behind an action, like, for example, obeying God rather than obeying man or the court of man or their opinions, then it's justifiable, I guess would be the way to say it. Now, it depends on certain examples. I would say, me personally, on the basis of Scripture as a whole, I would say I do hold and adhere to the view that, there are certain times where for the betterment of someone or for the glory of God in some situation, It may be even necessary. Now, I would not take that to just to be advantageous. That's not a white lie. Whatever's advantageous to you or more profitable to you or helps you earn more money or earn position in your job, those are not what we're speaking of when we say white lies. Now, if you have certain examples, you want to use.
So some of the examples that I was just thinking of were different cultural traditions, stuff like Santa Claus, the Easter Bunny, Tooth Fairy.
So I think the first question is slightly difficult, but it's easier to answer than these, and here's why. When you start talking about Santa Claus, and we're not talking about obviously the pastor theologian of the Council of Nicaea in 325 who was slapping Arius in the face.
Most people don't know that, do they?
Right. We're not talking about the historical Saint Nick or the historical Saint Nicholas. We're talking about the fat man that comes down the chimney and wants your cookies, for some reason makes you presents. And the Easter Bunny. These, and people watching may say this a lot. You may say, well, I've heard this question brought up, and it always comes back to Easter eggs, Easter Bunny, Saint Nick, Tooth Fairy. All of these white lies that we tell children are for their good, and they're just harmless. I know some people listening to me may get a little irritated with me about this when I say this, but that's nothing new. I think there is a problem with some of these traditions, and here's why. Number one, they're not based in fact, a lot of them. Number two, so they're not true. They're just simply not true. Number two, they oftentimes do have a root and an origin in pagan tradition and pagan customs. Number three, it's mythology. So you're telling someone that a super fast fat guy with a sleigh of reindeer travels the whole world in a single night to give people presents. It teaches children to some extent, and I know this is unpopular, but it teaches people to some extent, children growing up, to believe in magic. Would maybe be a better term than Christianity. This is not biblical Christianity. Now, am I faulting someone who teaches their kid to believe in Santa Claus or the Easter Bunny? No. I'm not saying they're terrible people. I'm not saying they're flagrant liars. I'm not even condemning their practice necessarily, but when we talk about this as an abstract, dry concept of is a white lie okay, is a false tradition, if you want to use that term, okay, the answer is, in a nutshell, no, it's not.
Do you believe that any of that, specifically about the cultural traditions, harms the presentation of the gospel to people or makes...
Yes, I do think. I'm sorry for cutting you off. Yes, I do think that. And here's why. I do think that traditions that are unbiblical... Okay, here's why. You tell me if this makes sense to you.
All right.
I believe that if you have a situation where you grow up and are told your whole life that you put a piece of enamel under a pillow and a tiny little fairy will come steal it from under your pillow and in exchange give you money, or that a bunny brings Easter eggs with candy and loads you up on sugar and caffeine, or that a fat man with these reindeer comes down your chimney and offers you these presents that you've asked for. Because all of these are Christian-related traditions, the tendency for people to think, and it's not a far leap, the tendency for people to think is, well, I grew up and I outgrew the tradition of the Easter Bunny, Santa Claus, the Tooth Fairy. Are all of the crazy things they told me at church just a tradition as well? Is everything that they taught me? Yeah, absolutely. And now, does this happen most of the time? No. But it can. Okay. It can. So you've got to be careful. Your slippery slope argument, your comment's very accurate. It can happen. In fact, it does happen. And we have to be able to say, this is low stakes, this is high stakes. So I'll be quiet on that.
All right. So since your podcast is called The Pastor and the Schoolmaster, and you being the schoolmaster, while Jacob, who's not present, is the pastor part, we'll kind of talk about you and your experiences as well. And I know that you teaching for the time that you have, whether it's being the Bible, or teaching back in, you were the college minister / worship leader, whatever you're called, and then of course your job now as a teacher.
Right.
Maybe somebody's asked you questions like this before.
All right.
Well, with you being a science teacher and all, have you ever had someone, whether it's any one of these areas, ask you about, does the Bible explain the existence of dinosaur fossils? And was it true? Were dinosaurs real? I mean, how does that coincide with biblical teaching?
Yeah, it's a great question. I get this question a lot at school, honestly. The kids ask me this question a lot. And I even have my coworkers, shout out James, asked me this question recently about dinosaurs. It's one that gets brought up a lot, knowing my degree in religion and my experience teaching the Bible as well as being a science teacher. Like you said, that's a natural question that gets brought up. It's a segue and a kind of a confluence of both disciplines. The straight answer is yes. Dinosaurs absolutely did exist. Does the Bible say that they existed? Well, I turned to Job 38. We know that Job 38, and I believe it's Job 40, talks about Behemoth and Leviathan. And Behemoth is normally classically understood. Remember, Job was written about 4,000 years ago, around the time of Abraham. Actually, the first book ever written in the Bible was Job chronologically, because he existed. He lived before Moses did, writing the Pentateuch. So Job was the first book actually ever penned historically in the Bible. So it was actually one of the first kind of major works of antiquity. And at the time, you see God with his own mouth referring to these beasts like Behemoth, Leviathan. Behemoth is oftentimes referred to as a land-dwelling dinosaur, like a long-necked Diplodocus, Bronchiosaur type animal. If you read, I'm not going to take the time to read the description, but if you look in the book of Job yourself, and I encourage you to do so, you see that he's got a long neck, long trunk, stout, stiff legs. It's definitely Land Before Time, Jurassic Park type stuff. You see these giant vertebrae in his neck that the Lord speaks about. And then Leviathan is oftentimes referred to as a dragon-type creature. That's how most commentators will view Leviathan, is that he's a winged beast. Now, dragon maybe minus the fire. It doesn't really say that, but he is a very intimidating creature, and the Lord talks about putting a brass ring through his nose to control him, to demonstrate his power. So dinosaurs absolutely were real. I believe, and we'll get to this later on in the questions, I'm sure, but I believe that the dinosaurs cohabitated with man. I take a young earth creationist view. I do believe that God wouldn't be speaking to Job about these dinosaur creatures as if he was expecting him to know them if he had no experience with these creatures.
Reference to them.
Right. It makes no sense. It's simple mythology like it is to us. But God was speaking in a very matter-of-fact way, in a way that he expected Job to understand. So dinosaurs, yes, were real. Yes, they cohabitated with man, and I'll turn it back over to you.
Well, one of the questions I had kind of as a follow-up on that is, I have seen some different things reported, either whether it be on social media, news of some sort, that talks about having even Ice Age type animals. Which is supposed to be hundreds of thousands of years. Still have DNA and skin on them, and things are not viable. And how would that just doesn't seem? It seems to me to be more of, I think you called it the young Earth.
Yeah, young Earth creation.
Young Earth creation. Yeah. So if something was hundreds of thousands or whatever years ago, not very likely, even under the most perfect conditions, viable DNA would matter. So the young Earth theory may actually help substantiate that.
Yeah, so let me know if I'm not actually answering your question when I say this. But the thing with the young earth creation oftentimes is viewed as the 6,000 literal years. I don't hold to that. The Bible doesn't give a timeline on how old the earth is. It doesn't tell how old the Earth is. It intentionally, I think, leaves that out. It's not really that much of a concern. The big concern is it really, really old, or is it rather relatively young? And the bigger issue is evolution true? That's really what all this boils down to. And I'm not going to get off into Darwin and evolution, but when we talk about the Ice Age, you talk about the preservation of animal remains. We see them on Facebook, we see them on social media. I actually saw a picture yesterday of a woolly mammoth, a baby mammoth that had been preserved. And the situations are pretty simple. The requirements and prerequisites are pretty simple. You need really dry climate with not much moisture, and you need really hard pressure, that's fossilization, or you need really, really cold, dry climate. And for a fast, not only death, but burial. So I won't get off into the whole geologic process of that. But yes, to answer your question, it's entirely likely, in fact, it's probable that we will and have found viable DNA evidence within these creatures in their bones, soft tissue, because it is possible, just like cryogenics we're finding, to preserve remains for millennia, very, very long extended periods of time. And yes, it is possible to extract that DNA and then do, in my opinion, terrible things with it.
So do you believe that the reason for some of these things not jiving with one another, because you've got, well, and you being a science teacher, I know you would get this, that, they talk about stuff being carbon dating.
Yeah. And
they talk about, well, this is even the soil strata.
Yeah.
You go, this is the Pleistocene, I'm not a geologist, but the different layers.
Yeah.
And they say, well, that's because of this, and that's because of that. I mean, do you have any, not rebuttal, but any I guess your slant, or biblically what a potential answer for that? Those kind of things?
Okay, so help keep me on track on this, because there's a lot to this. But
all right,
when we talk about stratification of soil and fossils, right? That's what you're talking about.
Sure. Kind of hand in hand.
Because inside of the strata we find different fossils, and we talk about things like the Cambrian explosion, which is, 200 plus million years ago. We see in the fossil record, we see in the stratification of the soil that there was and this is archaeologically speaking here, that there was not much variety of animals. In fact, the organisms in the stratification before the Cambrian explosion were arthropods, very simple crustaceans, horseshoe crab type creatures. And then at that point in the Cambrian explosion, they call it that because in that short time period, there is a proliferation of different animal fossils, different kinds, the Bible term kinds, different body models, body plans, advanced fish, animals, mammals, amphibians. We see and again, I'm not an expert on this topic, but I do know that there is evidence that in this one tiny little epoch of, again, that old Earth creationism view, in a very short period of time, you see the fossil record explode by the thousands of times over with new creatures. And I would argue that is creation. Now, real quick before I let you go on, the stratification issue, same thing with carbon dating. The stratification issue is a misnomer. It's misleading. We know, for example, that they've tested the Shroud of Turin, the burial cloth of Jesus Christ, allegedly throughout history, and I'm inclined to believe it was a real thing, that they have tested it and that it was, from the 1300s, it was a forgery. But there was a fire damage and smoke done to it, and there are other snippets they've taken it because of carbon dating, and the smoke didn't change it at certain parts, and it believed to go back to the 1st century and could very likely be the real thing. Carbon dating and fossils are the exact same way. Go ahead.
So that's a silly way of asking. Carbon's atomic number is 12, right?
Yeah.
So what's carbon 14? What is
that?
So,
okay, so carbon 14 is fossilized remains. So there's 3 forms of carbon on planet Earth. There's carbon 12, carbon 13, carbon 14. You're carbon 12, living beings are carbon 12. 6 protons, 6 neutrons. Now, carbon-14 is 6 protons, of course, 8 neutrons. So this is where you get your number. So you end up with 2 extra neutrons via the fossilization process. So once an animal is dead, fossilized, again with those specific situations, because again, most life that ever existed on the planet does not end up as a fossil. I can't say that strongly enough. It has to have certain situations. I've kind of already gone over it.
Rare situations.
Yes. But what it is, and here's where the flood comes in, what it is it has to be specific, fast, swift, powerful, with a lot of force, and oftentimes with a lot of water. Now, not always. The water is optional, but the process can still take place. What I'm saying is carbon-14, let me look in the camera when I say this, carbon-14 is faulty so many times because it assumes that there has been a static state of affairs on planet Earth for the whole creation. In other words, carbon-14 assumes that the prerequisites that create fossilization have never changed. I beg to differ. I would very much say it's a pre-flood and a post-flood world.
Which is actually where I was going with my next question. Tell me about what science, we hear about the flood in the Bible. And we know that with Noah built the ark and all that.
Right.
So is there any scientific evidence for the Great Flood?
Oh, absolutely.
So biblical evidence and some scientific evidence.
So the biblical evidence, of course, is that the Bible teaches it. And the Bible is our sole and final authority, or it ought to be. And so the Bible, of course, teaches it, Old and New Testament. It's not even a question. Jesus himself references it. And I want to say this shameless little plug here, Dad. When we talk about the flood, it's one of those things that's so hotly debated. It's so hotly talked about, even in Christian circles and Christian science circles and other religions, that we oftentimes forget that Jesus himself spoke multiple times about the flood as if it was a real incident, a real occurrence, which means for people out there who have a problem with the flood and the idea of a worldwide flood, your biggest issue is its biggest proponent, which is Jesus Christ. He himself, being the God-man, talked about it as if it was real. He believed it to be true. So either it happened, like he said, or he's wrong and in error, and that's impossible. So the flood happened on the authority of Jesus Christ himself. Now, historically, we know that there are over 300 cultures, ancient cultures, Egypt, Samaria, Babylon, which Samaria is sort of Babylon, Medo-Persia, a lot of these ancient cultures.
I think even some of the Mayan and
absolutely.
those kind of things.
Absolutely, and they have gods and deities that are devoted to the cause of the flood, things like that. Obviously, we would say false gods. And so the issue is that many times a lot of people don't understand, but cultures outside of the Bible, hundreds of them, speak of the Great Flood, speak of the antediluvian incident and occurrence of Noah. Now, they may call them different names. Like, for example, one of the oldest texts we have in recorded history, which is, what's it called? The Epic of Gilgamesh, right? Which was written in Samaria. It was believed to even be written before the Old Testament, even before Job, possibly even somewhere around 5,000 years ago, which is right about the time of Noah. They think Noah lived potentially about 5,500 years ago. Epic of Gilgamesh was written maybe 500 years. One of the first written language stories ever.
Written by non-quote-unquote Christians.
Absolutely, yes. By a guy supposedly named Gilgamesh, who was in the story believed to be 2/3 God, 1/3 man. Interestingly enough, he talks about really weird creatures, which we'll get to, I think, maybe more later. But he talks about weird creatures, weird science, weird incidents, and he talks about the Great Flood. And he refers to the God of the Great Flood, the one he does not serve, interestingly enough.
That's right.
Yeah, and so...
But he acknowledged him. But
we also know historically that the climate, and if you want to go back to the dinosaurs and animals that existed there at that time, and the way their body plans are so different. For example, 6-foot dragonflies, now they're that big. there was more oxygen present, and there's a whole lot of science that goes into this. But before the flood,